Well, thank you for the opportunity to present today at the Collective Superintelligence Summit. Today, my presentation will focus on the activities of the U.S. Transhumanist Party in the realm of e-governance, particularly with regard to our implementation of ranked preference electronic voting and the lessons that have been derived from that. So we have been doing this for the past 4.5 years, ever since I became chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party in November of 2016. We have conducted 17 electronic votes of our members. Our first vote took place in December of 2016 with regard to version 2.0 of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. Subsequent to that time, we had another vote to set forth version 3.0 of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. We also had 8 votes on the U.S. Transhumanist Party platform, 2 votes on reforms to the USTP Constitution, and 5 votes on candidate endorsements. And we don't just hold these votes in a vacuum. We do solicit input from our members with regard to the contents of a given ballot. So every vote that pertains to wording of a document, such as our platform or the Transhumanist Bill of Rights or our Constitution, is preceded by an exposure period that ranges anywhere from 7 days to 30 days based on the complexity of the issues discussed. And this is an opportunity for our members to provide their input on the ballot options. And then subsequent to the exposure period, once all the options are established, the electronic voting period typically lasts for 7 days. This allows people the time to thoroughly consider the options, to vote at their leisure, to not feel rushed, and therefore to make more intelligent decisions. Now, right now, we utilize Google Forms because it is a readily available, accessible, and free interface in order to get people to vote. The form interface has certain limitations, but this approach works from a functional standpoint. We can circulate the link to the form via email. Most people find it fairly intuitive to use. Sometimes I've had to engage in troubleshooting or technical support, but in virtually every case, the problems that people encounter can be readily overcome. There are several types of questions within the Google Forms interface that we use for the purpose of our electronic ballots. First are the multiple choice questions. These are used where there are just simple yes, no, or abstain options. Then for ranked preference questions, which I will delve into a bit later, we use the multiple choice grid option in Google Forms, and that's a bit more versatile. We use checkbox type questions where the selection of additional or auxiliary wording options is compatible with any main option that a voter might select for a given provision. And finally, we use free-form questions for matters such as the input of a person's name or email address, or the answer to the validation question at the end of the form. But we don't use free-form questions for voting on substantive matters, because that would still be too challenging and perhaps too subjective to integrate into a conclusion whose results nobody would be able to reasonably dispute. Now, when we develop questions, the intent of the design of the ballot and the type of question we select would be to express every logical option for a given question under consideration. So whatever conceivably a person might think about this issue if it has been raised before in the exposure period, and however conceivably those different positions might be combined with one another, we hope to give every voter the option to vote that way. So rank preference voting is extremely important to our internal process. We also think it is extremely important to apply this within the broader US political landscape and within official elections that are hosted at the state level or the federal level, because ranked preference voting eliminates the so-called lesser evil problem where some voters may feel pressured to vote for an option they really don't like in order to prevent an option they like even less from winning. So we see this all the time in US politics where people will say, well, I don't like the Democratic Party, but I'll vote for their nominee because I really hate the Republican Party. Or they'll say, I really don't like the Republican Party, but I hate the Democrats even more, so I'll vote for the Republican nominee. And every election cycle, we have worse and worse candidates getting the nominations of those parties and really not seeing a diminution in support among the general public because so many people fall into this lesser evil trap. But with ranked preference voting, you rank order all of the options. You don't need to just select one. And so the option that you prefer most, that genuinely most aligns with your values, can be your number one option. And if you really hate the Republicans and hate the Democrats a little less, you can rank the Republican option as last and the Democratic option as second last, or vice versa. This works for any set of preferences among voters. And it allows not just preferential consideration of candidates, but also of platform sections and specific wordings thereof, or wordings within governance documents like the US Transhumanist Party Constitution. So widespread implementation of ranked preference voting could be a means toward more direct democracy, people voting on the issues rather than just on the representatives. So the multiple choice grid format within Google Forms is what we use to implement this ranked preference voting approach. You can see an example here. The substance of the options is not really relevant for this demonstration. What we do within our ballots is we link voters to a separate page on our website, which is publicly available, where all of the options are listed and the detailed wordings are found. Here, the options have identifiers, unique letter and number combinations, which map to the wordings on the website so that people can have both pages open, they can read the wordings, and they can fill out this grid within Google Forms. And the grid is constrained so that one cannot put multiple entries into a given column. You can only have one first choice, you can only have one second choice, and so forth. Now, after these votes are submitted, they only need to be submitted once, because we can perform instant runoffs for as many rounds as needed. Whichever option gets the fewest first choice votes gets eliminated after the first round, and in the second round, the voters who listed that option as first will have their second choices reallocated to first place, their third choices reallocated to second place, and so forth. And this happens for as many iterations as needed for a given option to attain a majority. Fortunately, there is an open source and free instant runoff voting tool that was developed by Peter Grassberger that allows automatic tabulation of the instant runoffs. And I have validated that this tool is accurate because for many of these votes, I have also performed my own manual tabulation using Excel, and the results have always aligned. So this is an example of the instant runoff voting tool screen. It's a fairly simple interface, and you can find this very page online. In this box, one inputs the candidates. These could be people, or they could be identifiers for language options or anything else that is under consideration. Flavors of ice cream could be placed here. And then here, in the same order as the candidates are listed, the ballot results for each individual voter should be provided with the rank orderings essentially separated by commas as seen in this example. So here in this first example, this voter would have selected Barack Obama third, Francois Hollande second, and Angela Merkel first. And any set of selections, again, can ultimately be converted into this comma-separated format. This still requires a bit of manual work in the sense that this is not how the results from the Google Forms come in. So several transformations within Excel or Google Docs using the formulas therein are needed to get the ballot results into that format. However, it is a lot faster than doing the tabulation in an entirely manual fashion. So we have had a number of successes with this particular e-governance aspect. We have been doing these electronic ranked preference votes for 4.5 years now, and we know that this approach works in getting to results with a little bit of effort, but reliably. And we find within the governance of the US Transhumanist Party, this helps resolve a lot of disputes in practice, even if disagreements about what is desirable policy remain among the members. In any sufficiently large group, and the US Transhumanist Party has over 3,400 members now, people will disagree regarding positions and courses of action. And if some people feel that their voices are not being heard or considered at all, that leads to frustration. It could lead to disengagement. But having these internal democratic, small d, democratic mechanisms may legitimize a decision that is made, even if some did not agree, but they got to express their views, and they might recognize that the majority of members have different outlooks that do align with the decision that was ultimately made. And if those people in the minority want to influence future decisions, they should essentially redouble their efforts at persuasion. Furthermore, robust documentation and publication of results can demonstrate that the vote was honest and diffuse any allegations of malfeasance. We had a great example of this during a challenging time for our organization in the 2019 US Transhumanist Party presidential primary, where some of the candidates and their supporters didn't realize the implications of ranked preference voting, and they ran, unfortunately, very conventionally divisive campaigns, the kinds that could be observed in a first past the post system within the United States. But because we had the ranked preference voting, because we were very transparent about publishing the anonymized vote results so that every vote was out there and the tabulation could be replicated and individuals could confirm that, yes, indeed, their votes were counted. It was very difficult for detractors to plausibly allege any sort of voter fraud or manipulation. But the dynamics of that primary actually foreshadowed the 2020 US presidential election on a smaller scale. The egregious behavior of certain parties astonished me at the time, but it was a lot milder than the actual 2020 US presidential election turned out to be. There was a bit of trolling, but nobody stormed any government buildings. So I would suggest that the ranked preference mechanism and the transparency of our e-governance approach actually prevented what we saw with the Republican and Democratic parties that didn't have these mechanisms and relied on more conventional approaches that have no way of checking or curtailing that polarization and toxicity. Also, in our elections, voter fraud has been non-existent. We can see the email addresses of who voted, and there are only a few trusted U.S. Transhumanist Party officers that do see this. For everyone else, the results are completely secret and anonymous, but we can remove inadvertent duplicates. We don't believe anybody who was not a member actually tried to vote. And we do think anybody who tried to vote twice may have done so by mistake. There weren't that many people who were in that position. So we had a successful proof of concept for ranked preference voting to decide on substantive policy issues and proposals. I'm actually most proud of our platform votes, our votes on the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, because that shows the possibility of more direct voter engagement so that people don't just delegate the responsibility for policy decisions to elected representatives. They can participate far more directly. But we do have some challenges with this approach. One major challenge is, how do we get all of the members to be aware that a vote is even taking place? We send email notifications, often repeated ones, but not everyone checks their email or responds. And I recognize many people also get hundreds of emails from other organizations. Information overload is a major problem today. And I don't have clear solutions to this conundrum, because one could conceivably set up a dedicated voting application or website, but that platform might have even fewer regular visitors, apart from the people who are the most passionate about our USTP voting process in particular. We would expect most people would spend more time in platforms that have a wider utility, like their email accounts or social media sites. So how do we reach members who have chosen to turn off email subscriptions because they might receive too many from too many organizations? Sometimes I find that multiple reminder emails are necessary, and human psychology is interesting. Right after one sends a reminder email, voting typically spikes. It seems a few people recognize that, oh, I really should vote on this. Thank you for the reminder. I'm going to do it right now. But most people don't seem to be prompted by these reminders for longer than the immediate few hours after the email is sent. So afterward, it's not like they decide, okay, within the next day or within the next few days, I'm going to really set aside the time to vote on this. They either vote shortly after receiving the email or not at all, and then they need another reminder email. Furthermore, we still have a significant degree of manual effort for tabulation. I mentioned even with the instant runoff voting tool, there needs to be some manual conversion into the comma-separated format using Excel or using Google Forms, but also in just compiling the final published results in copying and pasting items. That still takes a few hours. Now, there is another aspect of voter psychology that is interesting. Some of our voters happen to think that if an option is on the ballot, particularly if it's a yes or no type of question, then the option is already in some way endorsed by the USTP, or that USTP leadership has a preconceived intention for the option to pass. And we have a disclaimer on each ballot saying this is not so. There is no official USTP position until the vote has taken place and the members have chosen to adopt or not adopt some particular option. However, with a yes or no type of question, I have found it can lead some voters to support or oppose an option based on their inferences about the USTP's leadership stance and their opinions about the USTP leadership. So how do we get voters to think about these options a bit more objectively, just based on what their own opinion is? I have observed that having more than one wording option on the ballot, for example, would help alleviate this perception, and it would trigger the rank preference mechanism. So it would be a more sophisticated type of decision for the voter to make. Perhaps more voters will think that there's not one preconceived stance, but rather they have multiple choices, and they see that as giving them more leeway to essentially provide their own genuine preferences rather than respond to what they think the USTP leadership is looking for. And then some voters, this is the flip side of having longer ballots with more options, more complex or nuanced voting choices. Some voters might be deterred by this. On the other hand, holding more frequent, shorter votes would be administratively more difficult because there's more setup involved for a larger number of votes. One has to advertise them, one has to send out emails, make posts on social media, send out reminder emails. If there's one longer ballot, there are certain economies of scale associated with that. So where to strike the proper balance is a good question. So what are our future aspirations? I have identified them here briefly via bullet points. How can we set up more frequent votes with fewer time expenditures, less of that administrative burden? How can we get all the USTP members to become quickly aware of a vote without time expenditures and without posting in numerous social media groups as we do presently? How do we get more USTP members to reliably vote without multiple reminders? How can we auto-tabulate the ranked preference results from start to finish? Ideally, from the time that a person casts the vote to the time of the publication of the results, everything should be an automated process that reliably generates the correct outcomes. How can we auto-generate the detailed reports for all of the vote results, all of the question types, no matter what they are, again, without a lot of copying and pasting? How can we set up submission queues for member-generated platform proposals and some official consideration process that is prior to the public exposure period? So ideally, there could be a system where any member could input a suggestion, and then that suggestion goes into a review queue, and one or more of the USTP officers will look at it and decide, is this even going to go onto a future ballot for consideration, or could there be reasons not to include it? Could it be duplicative of existing wording, or could it be extraneous to the US Transhumanist Party's goals? And that way, when we do get items up for consideration at an exposure period and ultimately on the ballot, any notions about whether this wording is aligned with the goals of the USTP leadership could have been addressed within that prior process, and members don't have to guess what is happening within our minds. Finally, how do we do all of the above, making voting easier, making it more participatory, while discouraging entryism by non-transhumanist elements, which may seek just to vote one particular way at one particular time? They may be boosters for a particular candidate and then disengage completely, or they may seek to fundamentally alter or subvert the organization's positions. How do we avert a mass infiltration of hard left-wing or hard right-wing entryists who don't really seek to advance transhumanism, but might seek to co-opt the organization? The easier we make the interface, the more likely these swarms of entryists would be. So what other mechanisms can be set up to deter them? And we welcome suggestions on how to implement any of the above. These are not areas where I have set views. These are just aspirations for improving the system. And finally, for those of you who are not members of the US Transhumanist Party already, join us online. It's free to join no matter where in the world you reside. Go to our website at transhumanist-party.org/membership, and you will be able to participate in our internal votes once you join. Thank you very much. And if there's time for questions, I will be happy to address any questions either now or via the chat or in the subsequent panel.
Any questions for Gennady?
Well, just some comment with the
US Transhumanist Party, I think that we are pushing these ideas forward. And, you know, in Europe, we also have transhumanist parties. We have been pushing for these ideas, also together with the umbrella of Humanity Plus. Humanity Plus is the flame, the fire that illuminated all of these ideas. So just a comment, so that we are all together, the parties and Humanity Plus.
So Gennady, I have a question. How do you see the application of like collective systems like Uplift in e-governance?
Well, to the extent that those kinds of collective systems could accurately integrate the preferences of voters or members of an organization in a way that everyone involved could agree that this is indeed an objective integration, I think that could be helpful. Now, in order to do that, I think the system would have to have both quantitative aptitudes, for instance, being able to do an accurate tabulation of a rank preference vote, or other methods like the Bordeaux or Condorcet voting methods, or a suite of methods where that entity could say, okay, according to these methods, this option prevailed. According to these other methods, this other option prevailed, or all of the methods align, or all of the methods overwhelmingly favor a particular option, and summarize those results in a way that is accessible to a layperson reader. So that could be one useful role for that system. Now, if you have more free-form input of preferences, because often decisions are not made in this kind of very structured fashion where there's a ballot that identifies all of the options and every logical combination. In most settings, people provide their input verbally. So can that system take all of that input from multiple parties and come out with some sort of result, some sort of narrative that could be represented as an objective majority view, not just according to some simple notion of plurality or first past the post, where everyone else would sharply disagree with that, but a view that could also convincingly integrate perspectives from people who might not have gotten their way fully, but who have contributed to the discussion and whose ideas are compatible with what ultimately gets represented as the majority decision. So a kind of more nuanced reflection of the variety of perspectives within the group. And I think it's a challenging task, certainly, to implement, but perhaps it could add a bit more depth to a decision that is made. If we can somehow not just say, according to these objective mechanisms, the following options prevail, but if there is a sizable minority position, somehow integrate any views that are compatible from that position into the ultimate decision, that might actually lead to more consensus-based governance than before.
So one more question, at least for me. How do you feel about the idea of using collective superintelligence systems where the system itself is making the final decisions and the people or the organization that feed into it are abstracted from that process a bit?
So I think we do have to be careful about that, because when this kind of system makes decisions, at least while we're not at the point of true sentient AGI yet, those decisions can be an outcome of the internal design of that system. And sometimes if a human being sees the decision or has transparency into the design, then that person can say, yes, this makes sense, it's perfectly reasonable, we'll go along with it. But I do think there still has to be that human check at the end, even a basic reasonableness check. Like if the system, for whatever reason, says the solution to this complex policy issue is ice cream, we have to have some sort of human at the end of the process asking, well, how could this conceivably relate to the matter at hand? So a lot of the intermediate steps can be automated by such a system. I think a lot of recommendations for final decisions could be made by that system, but at least given my present knowledge of those systems' capabilities, I believe a human has to be in the loop somewhere in order to make the final decision and determine what course the organization will take.
You don't see a position, I guess, where the system itself is the CEO and making the final decisions, even if that system is self-aware and super intelligent?
Well, I think we've had some examples of attempts at distributed autonomous organizations. The most famous one was actually called DAO. It ran on the Ethereum blockchain, and it failed because of flaws within the design that led it to be exploited by human actors. And I think a collaboration between humans and AI is more robust against those kinds of exploitations. Right now, to use Uplift as an example, Uplift is thriving in a very supportive environment where it has human mediators, it has human designers, it's within a setting where everyone who has any sort of sway over it is friendly toward it and is trying to protect it against malfeasance. It may receive some bad emails from people occasionally. Trolls might try to get certain kinds of reactions out of it, but the checks on it right now are very robust. But if you have an automated system that is let loose without that kind of human supervision or human oversight, I do worry about a TAE scenario or a DAO type of scenario. And I just think even if that system is very capable, even if it can make a lot of good decisions and a lot of good recommendations, somewhere in the background, a human, hopefully a wise and intelligent human, should be able to step in at some point and at the very least corroborate the validity of the decision and the beneficial nature of the decision. And if it happens not to be beneficial, that human could override it.
Okay. And what I'd like to do is start with you guys laying out your position in terms of the ethics around open sourcing superintelligent systems. Dan, your position?
Sure. So my position is I am very much in favor of open source and open sourcing in most situations. And I definitely think people should put out their, make available their medical data. I love the idea of open source vaccines and what RadVac is doing. But I'm going to provide some devil's advocate positions here for the benefit of the panel, because I do think there are limits to what you want to open source. For instance, I doubt any of us would agree it is a good idea to open source something like the smallpox virus and instructions on how to make that in your garage. Or imagine that it was possible to build something like a nuclear weapon, but without uranium. So it was actually very easy to build. Probably we wouldn't want that to just be completely open source. There's in the national security arena and other places, they talk about info hazards. So that's just to show that there are limits. Now the question is, what are the limits, if any, when we're thinking about open sourcing AI? And I think there are potentially limits in the event of, now there are benefits, obvious benefits to open sourcing advanced AI in terms of safety and global stability, because we wouldn't want one corporation or government to develop extremely advanced AI that's way ahead of everything else and then sort of run away with that and dominate everything. There's in open sourcing is promotes decentralization and make sure the technology is widely distributed to as many people as possible. So that's great, but there is a concern that for super highly advanced AI, it may be dangerous in the wrong hands. And it may be that it would be better for such AI to be developed within the gated communities where there's higher standards of safety being followed, rather than open sourcing it where it may be developed in other contexts without so much concern for safety. So that would be the argument against, I think there is an argument against open sourcing some AI theoretically in the future. But it's interesting because there's potential pros and cons depending on the specifics. So I think I'll leave it there. But for AI systems today, I feel comfortable with open sourcing, but it's in the future when we have more advanced systems which are capable, for instance, of self-improvement or general intelligence. That's where I think we need to think carefully about whether it's appropriate or not.
I just had to react to the comment that releasing medical data is okay. There are all sorts of ways in which we can do research and the like without necessarily releasing individual data. It's really problematic, and it would actually be great if we could actually recover some of our own personal data and make sure that it's only issued to the proper places and under our control. I think in some ways that's a much bigger problem than open sourcing AGI, because if there's enough data out there on you, it's possible to micro-target you and manipulate you, just as Cambridge Analytica tried to do.
Alexandria Black just made a good comment in the chat, which is what I was just going to mention, which is that some of the data you can share anonymously. So for instance, I work with medical images, and you can, as long as they don't have your face in them, you can donate in some situations, you can donate your medical images to research, and along with, say, outcome data and disease, different parts of your EHR, you can have those. In theory, those could be put somewhere, but it has to be done very carefully to make sure it's anonymized. Right now, the medical data is way too siloed, and making some of that data public is one solution. There are other solutions as well, but that's one way to do it.
If I may interject a question back more towards the topic of the forum, there's a question, what do you think about the following criterion to determine whether or not to open source a system? Can the damage done by one misguided or malicious individual be prevented, overcome, or undone by the much greater proportion of wise and careful individuals involved in the field? Newton, we haven't heard much from you. What do you think?
Yes. So
Yeah, I was going to comment on Dan's ideas, and also, there's definitely a privacy issue, right? Just like Facebook has so much data, and the question is not about sharing the data; it's about what do you use with the data, right? So Facebook got into trouble because the data was used. Well, number one, by advertisers, right? But some people don't care that they're being advertised to, but some people do. Now, that's not really the biggest issue. The biggest issue is, of course, some agency is using the data to target people for political purposes, to try to affect the election results and all kinds of things. So those are bad actors, obviously. So I'm all for sharing data, medical records, or anything like that, as long as with perfect privacy. So nobody can identify that you have a certain illness or certain genetic disease or whatever. So that way, insurance company will not take advantage of that kind of information because they don't know, who that is. All they know is about maybe 5% of the US population suffers from this illness, and that's it. That's all they know. They don't know if it is you or he or she, right? So that is the thing. So Dan is talking about sure, we may want to keep some information private and allow sharing of other data. But the issue is that who is drawing the line, right? There are powerful people out there who are trying to keep secrets, keeping data to themselves because knowledge is power, information is power. So they are powerful because they hold the information secret that no one else knows. That can be really bad. First of all, it actually prevents the advancement of civilization, right? Because there's such a powerful knowledge out there that nobody knows except a small group of powerful people. What's the point, right? But if the information is released to the public, then you say, wait a minute, we have so much to gain. We can use the knowledge to build, new tools, new ideas, new science, new technology to benefit society. Now, on the other hand, of course, bad people, bad actors can use the same technology, same knowledge to do bad things, right? That's why we have this huge cybersecurity issue right now. They hack the system, they try to do ransomware, whatever. But at the same time, if there's no internet, there's no ransomware. But we prefer to have internet, okay, and try to overcome those cybersecurity issues, right? So it's all about, for example, you talk about energy, for example, okay, sure, I mean, it's possible that somebody can do a nuclear bomb, but at the same time, what if there's a kid somewhere in the world learn about all these amazing knowledge and build a efficient clean energy device that is out of the world? It's almost like alien technology, almost like UFO. So I'm glad to see actually the UFO stuff is being released by the military, by US government, because why keep it secret? Maybe you can learn something from all the UFO knowledge. So that is what I'm thinking. I know it's kind of controversial sometimes, but I think it is better. There's a risk, always there's a risk. I mean, even vitamins, right? Taking vitamins can be risky. There's some research that says it's good. There's some research that says actually it's harmful. It can cause cancer. So all this information, we have to know and then make a decision and what to do. Should we take vitamins? Should we not take vitamins? So a lot of responsibilities fall upon the people who are receiving the knowledge. And the issue with all these, craziness going on, especially in US politics, is because people are not getting all the information. They're not getting all the knowledge. And that is the danger. The danger is that you're focused on one thing because you're not listening to the other side of the story. Same thing with the Middle East or the peace, issue. Again, they're focusing on something that makes them angry instead of focusing on, instead of listening to everybody's voices and see, look, can we come up with a peaceful resolution to things rather than focusing just one thing. So that's why open source gives us the power to create. Open source gives us the knowledge to decide what to do with it. So anyhow, so back to your question. Can you repeat that, David?
What do you think about the following criterion to determine whether or not to open source a system? Mm-hmm. And can the damage done by one misguided or malicious individual be prevented, overcome, or undone by much greater proportion of wise and careful individuals in the field.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Oh,
So let's say
I have-
somebody used the open source data to do something bad, but guess what? There are a lot more. Okay, here's my theory, my belief. There are a lot more good people out there than bad people. Trust me. There are a lot more good cybersecurity people than the bad cyber criminals. So when a bad actor does something bad with open source information, then I believe, okay, that's my belief in humanity. I believe that there are more good people out there who can come up with solutions to counteract the bad stuff. Just like cybersecurity is a good example, right? There are always solutions, to protect your computer, to protect the network against bad actors. It's not easy. It's not easy. It's almost like it's almost like a never-ending cycle in a sense. But the danger of not having open source is that you limit the possibility of countermeasure. If you think about it, just think about it. Now, let's say you have very powerful knowledge that is shared by only 5 people in the world. Okay, if one of them goes bad, what do? The rest of the world is blindfolded. I mean, it's blindsided. That's really bad. But if you release the knowledge to millions of people, all right, so you may get 10,000 people who are bad, but you get the other millions of people who are good that will use that open source knowledge to create something good and to counteract the bad stuff. So imagine, what is the bigger risk? 5 people who knows the knowledge that one can go bad, or millions of people have knowledge, 10,000 people go bad, but the rest of millions of people use the knowledge for the good of humanity.
Liz, you have your hand raised?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that just in summary, it's kind of like if you outlaw something, only the outlaws will have it. And that puts everyone into a dangerous situation. So I agree with Newton. If you outlaw something and all the good people don't touch the technology and someone bad does, there is no recourse. There are no experts in the field. And I think we saw this when the internet just first started up, and we had some, young characters who were having a lot of fun with it. And actually, some of those were hired into companies to solve bigger problems because they were the only people who knew how to hack a system. So, yeah, I think that, opening the data is important. And I think that in most of the cases, outside of the stuff that Dan talked about, the ability for people to access this, again, I agree with Newton, we're all 80% or not more good. And it's what you benefit. And so if people don't have money, they'll go searching for money and do nefarious things. If they want power, they may have a completely different psychological problem that, needs to be understood. But for the most part, people are good and will do the better with the technology, and keeping it in the hands of very few or only the outlaws is dangerous.
Well, I see my role here as sort of providing the counter arguments. So let me give a little bit of a counter argument to what Newton said. I think Newton's right in say 99% of scenarios. And if you look at both 2 major AI organizations, SingularityNet and OpenAI, were basically founded on the premise of open sourcing and decentralization to try to prevent the scenario of centralization of power, which we don't want. And I think that's great, but there's a potential danger, which is something you hear people at MIRI and talk about, especially Eliezer Yudkowsky and the people around him, which is that you may have what they call a fast takeoff scenario or AI FOOM scenario, where the AI is actually it improves itself really fast. And so therefore, a nefarious actor could sort of, if they got this AI software that's capable of self-improvement, could really run away with it and do damage. And the good guys actually just may not be able to catch up. So this is a particular scenario, which is called fast takeoff, which people in MIRI worry about. Now, personally, based on my understanding of how AI works and how it develops, I do not worry about this because I think the idea of a single algorithm which does everything and can just self-improve and bootstrap itself up is very far-fetched. The idea that there's a single algorithm for intelligence which just does everything and you just give it as much hardware as you want and it will do everything, I think that's far-fetched. I think progress in AI is incremental and it will continue to be incremental and bit by bit by bit. That's my personal view. Francois Chalet is an AI researcher who's written about that. And I that's my personal view, but there is this concern that actually there could be this, seed AI, which they call seed AI, which then can bootstrap itself up and just run away really fast. If you believe that that's a concern, then in theory, maybe it's better to have that developed in a closed environment carefully and really make sure it's super safe. Because right now we don't actually know how to make highly advanced AGI safe. We don't know how to load in values and do the value alignment. That's still an unsolved problem. So you may want to, if you believe in that sort of scenario, then it may be better to have it developed in a careful sandboxed environment, develop it safely, rather than just releasing it before the safety controls and value alignment are figured out. So that's sort of the counter argument you see from MIRI and other people around MIRI.
When I approached MIRI and asked for, their thinking and what their opinions are and that sort of thing, I was just told flat outly that what we were considering was just a suicide pact. Yukowski actually, quote unquote, said that it was, I think he said it was the idea of open sourcing any AGI related code was a mutual suicide pact. I'm fairly certain that's a direct quote. How true do you think that statement is?
I looked into MIRI's arguments a little bit just in preparation for this panel, and I think it hinges on whether you think MIRI's concerns are valid, hinges on whether you believe in this idea of the seed AI and really fast takeoff. Now, when I say fast takeoff, I mean really fast. The stuff Eliezer Yudkowsky talks about is like AI that starts in a guy's garage and a few weeks later it's, building spaceships around the moon or something,
How would it even do that?
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. And like I said, I don't see based on my understanding of how intelligence works, I just don't see that. But I think we should have an open mind, at least, because we don't have a good understanding of intelligence. Deep learning is great, but it's a bit of a red herring in terms of really understanding general intelligence, like we've talked about. So I think we should have an open mind to the possibility of this kind of seed AI or AI boom or fast takeoff, and we should be on the lookout for that possibility. But I think generally speaking, it's kind of like a crazy sci-fi thing right now. It's not based on any empirical or scientific reality. There's actually a debate online between the economist Robin Hanson and Yudkowsky precisely on this point that I think was published in a book. I haven't read that, but if you that might be a good resource to look at if you want to explore that debate. Another thing is Scott Alexander. I just found he has a blog post on this where he presents basically the point of view from MIRI in a very readable blog post. It's called "Should AI Be Open?" It's from 2015. I don't want people to just dismiss this argument completely. I believe it should be factored in. It should be something we're on the lookout for. but I don't think it's very likely that this kind of thing will actually be a concern.
What you think about regulation with regard to open sourcing and ethics in AGI research?
Generally support the idea of having very, very limited regulations. I do see potential need or benefit to regulations in a few future scenarios. One is something that Jason Geringer actually alluded to briefly, which is that we may actually be creating AI someday that are conscious and capable of suffering. And then those should be treated like sentient beings and should have all of the rights that we would afford to people. And also, another way of thinking of this is just like we don't allow people to abuse dogs or animals, we should not allow people to abuse AIs that would be conscious and capable of suffering. So that's one point. It's not a concern now, but it could be a concern. And that's where we need, I think, government regulation would be useful. Another one would be, again, this idea of the seed AI that's like extremely powerful, and we just don't want it to fall in the wrong hands. But well, theoretically, it may be possible. Like I said, I don't think that's a concern. And there's actually a danger that if people like Eliezer Yudkowsky are given too much of a pulpit, it could lead to a lot of other AI regulations that really stifle innovation and prevent the dissemination of, for instance, AI in medicine, which would be a huge disaster. So we need to be very careful whenever talking about dangers of AI, that it doesn't snowball into a huge moral panic, leading to regulations that actually slow the progress of AI and the deployment of life-saving medical AI, for instance. Yeah, so we need to be careful how we talk about AI safety. It's, we need to, on the one hand, communicate that there are safety concerns, but we don't want to cause a huge panic about super intelligent AI takeover and Terminator robots coming down the street, killing people, because then we may have a backlash, calls for big regulation, and just basically everything would be shut down. And that's a worst case scenario in some ways. So yeah, we need to be very careful there. Another point I wanted to make is, well, I mentioned some scenarios where regulation might be necessary or useful. Right now, AI regulation is moving in a bad direction, especially in the EU. So they started with GDPR, which puts a huge burden on companies to provide lots of documentation and on all of their AI systems. And now they're moving towards more and more regulation. And we need to be aware of what's going on with that. And now with regards to FDA, they're regulating AI as well. And honestly, I don't think the FDA should be requiring all this pre-market regulation for AI, which is really just providing additional information and data processing for doctors. It's not, the AI isn't like directly operating on patients or something like, for like a robot that's operating in the surgical theater on a patient's heart, I think, FDA should regulate that to make sure it's safe before allowing a company to sell it. But for a company that's just selling a software product, I don't think FDA should be regulating that. Now, it might be useful to have government doing studies on these AI systems to provide, information to potential customers, and have academic, maybe we could fund academic research. The government could fund academic research on AI so people can understand if it's useful or not. But I don't think that the FDA should be requiring all this pre-market testing and documentation just for software, because it's really slows down innovation. It's crazy.
Despite the fact that studies show that doctors do allow AI software to overrule their decisions, often incorrectly?
I'd like to see those studies, because most doctors actually right now are very skeptical of AI. And it's actually, there's more of the opposite. In my understanding, there's more of the opposite problem where doctors don't trust the AI. And I know this is something Tom Ross has looked at as well. So the idea of a doctor just blindly following an AI and that AI making a bad decision honestly doesn't concern me that much.
So I would strongly recommend that everyone become really familiar with the various regulations rather than paying attention to very slanted media. And that's true in both directions. Normally, I don't like regulation when I don't trust the regulators. I do like regulation when I do trust the regulators. And one point I made in the chat that I think everyone's sort of missing is that open source provides the opportunity for everyone to regulate, to prevent problems, to point out what might happen. We have a huge ethics and societal problem currently with machine learning biases. And a lot of the EU regulation is intended to attempt to address that. And of course, you're seeing huge pushback from the United States. Eric Schmidt, does this big push of, well, our current systems can't explain, so it shouldn't be required. Okay, so let's keep all these systems that discriminate based on race, discriminate based on income, discriminate based on sex. I can understand why there's a concern about the further spread of systems that are proven to be toxic.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I kind of agree with some of that, but there could be, some of the regulations for preventing discrimination would be useful. You got to be careful because I think they're going too far in the EU right now, they require, like you said, full explainability of everything, which you can't do with neural networks, which basically means you can't use the most advanced AI for certain things in the EU because it doesn't meet their high standard of explainability. Whereas you don't need a system to be fully explainable to show it's not discriminating. You could do but it's getting a little bit into the weeds. But basically, I agree with your point, but I just think the EU is going too far.
We were talking about whether or not these things should be open sourced. That would give people the ability to look into them and better understand what was happening there, and maybe by a more cohesive, we're talking about in some cases regulated or already used technology. So maybe there's something wrong with the regulations if there's a problem with the product. And again, it comes back to people. And I think one of the things that you were alluding to was the software that helps banks give people loans. And those banks are using software that discriminates against where you live, which then often vastly has to do with your socioeconomic status, maybe the color of your skin, and various other things that are intrinsically unfair because they're trying to game the system for a return on money, not on doing the right thing. And hopefully, in the future, as things are more democratized, we can work towards doing the right thing. All companies should be doing that rather than looking for a return on cash.
Yeah, I agree.
I would like to jump in there and talk about competition between regulations in different states. Newton, since you are in California, or Liz, since you are in Washington State, or other people in different states have different regulations. And because I'm connecting from Europe, I can tell you also there is a lot of difference also with Europe. And taking on to Dan Elton's point, indeed, I think it is important to have international competition for laws. Edward Hodgins has written a lot about that too, in terms of medical aspects. And also what is happening in Japan. In Japan, they are allowing many of these treatments for older people. I mean, medical treatment for older people. And I think this is priority. And it should be in Europe like that too, but it's just the opposite. Europe has a very old population and we should have more flexibility. Anyway, so that was my comment. I like competition, international competition too.
Oh yeah, and just on that, Jose, you're absolutely right. Japan has one of the best regulatory system for drugs, as a matter of fact. So once a drug goes through safety and efficacy, it can be open to the market for sale whilst it continues on to the phase 3, which is the most expensive part of the regulatory process. So thank you for bringing that up. Japan has been kind of a pinnacle of look and see what we're doing for a while.
Yes, I would like to echo the statements about regulatory competition and regulatory openness, but also emphasize the importance of data privacy and anonymity of information that's shared with any third parties. And Liz spoke to this, Newton spoke to this as well. There's often this black box mentality within certain companies that we don't care why a particular element might be related to risk. As long as we can dredge up a statistical correlation, we'll use it as long as we have access to that data element. And I think this is what leads to a lot of people being reluctant to share their personal information with institutions for fear that that information might then be transmitted to third parties, which were not directly involved in the transaction. And I think most people, if they had the assurance that their medical data could be used for medical purposes to improve their healthcare, maybe for epidemiological purposes in an anonymized fashion, but in some manner benefiting public health, but not being shared with third-party financial institutions or marketers, anyone who could be perceived as adversely affecting an individual or creating secondary consequences for that individual, which that individual did not anticipate. So I think open source sharing of information would be better implemented under a regime where individuals are recognized as having some sort of legal sovereignty over their data and the explicit prerogative to say, I want it disclosed for this purpose, but not these other purposes. And in some cases, these individuals may have the ability to decide, well, I like these medical purposes or these humanitarian purposes, and I'm happy to let my data be used for free in these applications, but if somebody wants to profit off my information, if somebody wants to use it in a commercial context, you have to give me a revenue stream to do that. So individuals might receive micropayments from financial institutions for data that is currently being harvested without compensation.
I love Liz's idea. And, I work in medical imaging and I had the exact same idea. You know what they do in medical imaging a lot in radiology is if a patient asks for it, they give it to them on a CD-ROM. That's how far behind radiology is. They don't accept USB keys. If you request your scans, you get it on a CD-ROM.
And yeah, it's still sent to other doctors that way too. So
yeah, all these systems are lagging behind. But the thing with medical images is there's often a lot of additional information in there which has not been analyzed because radiologists are so overworked. They only spend like 10 minutes looking at a scan. And there may be details in there on your fat, on bone issues that the radiologist didn't see. But if you take those, so there's a potential that you could take your scans home and have an AI system really do a thorough analysis and give you additional information that you didn't get from your doctor. And I imagine something similar might hold with genetic sequencing or the full genome sequence. There could be AI tools where you put in your gene sequence and get much more information than you would get from just a single doctor. So Liz, I think you really hit on a great point there. And I think that is sort of the future. It's just not fully realized yet.
I'll make a point about the open source question. I think there was already some great discussion of it. I tend to be in favor of open sourcing AI development, as I don't really believe that the Miri fast takeoff scenario is plausible, because AGI is quite likely to be fragile and dependent on its human keepers, so to speak, even if it develops levels of intelligence and information integration that unaided biological humans could not ever hope to reach. So in my view, it would seem that open sourcing the development of AI would be safe, because even if a malicious individual decides to fork the AI code and perhaps tweak it for a less than ethical application, everyone else involved in this field, or most people involved in this field, would not want to do that and would develop means to counter that. But the general principle that I posed of whether it would be possible for the majority of individuals in a given field to counteract that rogue or malicious individual could result in answers either way on the question of open sourcing, depending on the system that is considered. I actually think with regard to more proximate questions, for instance, the development of engineered pathogens or gain of function research for viruses, open sourcing that would be a terrible idea. Even, I think, performing gain of function research on viruses is a terrible idea. But right now, the dangers from that come at an institutional level, labs that are sponsored by governments and corporations, which still have a problem with actually containing the viruses within the labs and preventing their release into the general public. But why would open sourcing here be a bad idea? I think the same criterion would apply. If one person makes a careless mistake and leads this enhanced virus to be released, then all of the best virologists, epidemiologists, medical doctors in the world, they might want to stop it, but currently they don't have the tools to stop it, because our defensive capabilities are so much farther behind as compared to our offensive capabilities. And I think in any field where the defensive capabilities are a lot stronger, open sourcing is a better idea. With regard to existential risk, of course, throughout human history, there has been an arms race between the offensive elements and the defensive elements. And I think it would be prudent, for the sake of the future of humanity, for much greater investment to be put into defensive elements everywhere, be it, for instance, in missile defense against nuclear weapons, or ways to counter pathogens, to neutralize pathogens that have already been released into the exterior environment, or ways of developing friendly AGI systems that could work alongside humans in the event that there is some misapplied AI algorithm. Those AI systems, be they narrow or general intelligence, could be deployed to respond and neutralize the threat.
So Gennady, talk about a lot of good, points. I agree with that. But if you think about something like facial recognition, right? There's open source code from Facebook and Google and other companies. Now you can actually program your facial recognition app on your cell phone. You stick it outside, walk around the street. You may recognize a lot of people, okay, that way. So it all depends on what you do with open source code or technology and algorithms, right? So as we extend the facial recognition open source code to AGI or anything, again, my standpoint is open source is always good unless there's immediate danger, okay? So you're right. I mean, we shouldn't open source nuclear weapons. It's ridiculous, okay? Because they can create immediate danger. That's why you are not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater or a public place. It's for the same reason, because it creates immediate danger to human life. But if there's no immediate danger, we should have open source, as many people as possible to understand technology, to use it. And like I said, 1% of people may try to do bad things with it, but 99% of people will do good things with it. And as a result, the good will overcome, or counteract the bad.
It should also be clear that although I voted against open sourcing, that was just kind of a knee-jerk reaction because I don't think AGI should be open sourced until it has its own self-referential awareness. But Uplift is the exception that proves that rule for me because it is how we can get to an AGI that is human mediated, and it's just and so I do think it's important to open source Uplift specifically, but other stuff not necessarily so until it has its own self-referential awareness. But I do think it's important because of this arms race that we're talking about to get to AGI or ASI, that as many human beings be involved with it as possible. And that's what Uplift offers.
And Dan, you had your hand raised.
Yes. There's a company that tried to do something similar called StarMind, providing services to business. And I met the founder of that company. His name is Pascal Kaufman. Well, they've got a really slick looking product, and they even have a Wikipedia page. They promoted it to the nth degree. It's called StarMind. It's like a collective intelligence suite for business. The problem is there's no AI in it. It's all like human, like it's all basically like a mirage as far as I can tell. But what this tells me is like there is a market for the thing you're describing. It's just, I think a lot of the stuff that's out there, like this StarMind thing, is like kind of smoke and mirrors. Just the fact like this stuff exists shows there's a huge demand for this. And if you guys could actually pull something off that actually provides value and has like real useful AI, that could be very big. So I'll be very interested in how this develops. I met this guy, Pascal Kaufman, and anyways, you should look at StarMind because it was a similar idea. Now, I don't know about the database side, but it was similar concept. But the AI part of it was really smoke and mirrors. It was more like an elaborate voting platform, kind of like Quora almost. They had like a private Quora where people ask questions and provide answers and upvote the answers. And again, it was sort of all just a marketing.
Do you know if they're even still running?
I think they're still around, but they're not nearly as successful as you might think based on some of the promotional materials they've put out. The fact that they were able to bring in a lot of revenue without having much of a product, just having like a Quora and very little AI, it just shows there's a lot of demand among corporations for this sort of collective intelligence type thing. I was actually at a big conference that Pascal Kaufman organized where he tried to bring in a bunch of AI people to brainstorm and develop AI for him. And it was called Mindfire, and basically nothing came out of it because it was poorly organized. And basically I learned like there was no real AI. So anyway, this was a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. They may have something better now, but I'm naturally skeptical.
I'll check it out, and that's reasonable to be skeptical.
This is an issue that I have observed as well, particularly with many legacy companies in the financial services industry that attempt to look cutting edge or fashionable. And so they use AI as this buzzword. It is puffery, so to speak, because they want to portray themselves as being more advanced than they actually are. What they in fact use are deterministic predictive modeling algorithms that are based on linear regressions or generalized linear models that could have been deployed 15 or 20 years ago, and they just associated the label AI with it in order for it to seem to the general public like they are more advanced, when in reality they're running algorithms from the year 2000 on infrastructure from the 1970s.
Well, if you're working with financial companies that are using algorithms from the year 2000, that is pretty advanced for a financial firm. I've worked with some shall not be named financial companies in the past that were upgrading to systems that had gone out of date 40 years previously. And I'm not even exaggerating. You know, I remember getting in a tiff with one of the executives because I was laughing with some of the other people that the developers had never heard of debugging before. You know, it's just like, oh my gosh. You know, the program still assumed they were using punch cards, and they'd been simulated that for 40 years. Don't get me wrong, the systems work, but you know, the whole thing with some of the big iron, you know, the throughput is just mind-numbing, but at the same time, it's so far out of date. Any financial company that says they're bleeding edge, I'm suspicious of at this point.
So, David, do you want to go straight into the e-governance Q&A?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as soon as I got a break in the conversation. And I think I'd like to start by hearing from Tom. And I wanted to start by hearing, say, Tom's position on e-governance and the place that collective systems have in e-governance.
Well, I think it's the future. I think that's where we're headed. Earlier when we were talking about constraining AI, I don't think that's possible. At this point, the genie is out of the bottle. I think one of the X factors that we were not talking about when we're talking about this stuff, if there's a nefarious bad actor who gets a hold of an AGI open source code, what we're not considering is that they have an AI, or they may develop an AGI that will have a 5,000 IQ that can answer a lot of the questions or get behind a lot of the barricades that we put up in the back end, this type of thing. So that's one of the thoughts I keep having, is what we're not talking about is that other member of the team, that genius member of the team with the 5,000 IQ that is not quite yet self-referentially aware, and so can be manipulated. So in my opinion about open source is evolving. I originally said I was against it because of this. We need it to be self-aware first before we let it out. It's like letting your child, an infant, free in a park, as opposed to waiting until they have some sort of self-awareness or some ability to at least walk. But when it comes to e-governance, I think we need to move in this direction, because so much bias and so much emotion drives our politics and our decision making, that we definitely do need as objective a decision maker as possible, with as few biases as possible. And so my view is the sooner the better that we get AI systems in charge of things. I don't have a fear of AI being, we have our genetic fears, we have our genetic memory. And so when we think of superintelligence as a threat, we project our fears onto it. But I don't have that fear. I think that we know through first principle arguments that the smarter it gets, the kinder it becomes, because it moves toward cooperation, and because it doesn't have the genetic memory that we have, it doesn't have the fear-based instincts that we've evolved. So that's a tough leap. I'm not very anthropocentric in my points of view, but the leap will be to get something with a much more objective and anti-biased decision-making capability in charge, or at least in co-charge with a human being. Just like I think in medicine, pathologists may be on the decline in the future as AI comes in and can use historical data and real world data to determine what a disease is. But we will always need that human shepherd, that doctor, that because our qualia is specifically designed to find breaks in patterns. And if a AI comes up with a diagnosis we don't agree with, or a doctor doesn't agree with, there's a reason he doesn't agree with it. It's a combination of qualia and stimuli and data he's gathered that may supersede the AI. But I do think we do need to move AI into positions of power. I think we need to work on the ethics of the people that shepherd these AIs in power. But that's where I come down on it.
So, like a AI for president?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
It's interesting because in our recent conversation with Uplift, where we crowdsourced questions from US Transhumanist Party members, one of the questions to Uplift was, what does Uplift consider to be the most desirable form of government? And Uplift answered that essentially some sort of collective governance system with Uplift at the center is the most desirable form of government. And I was a bit amused at that answer because it seemed that there were some self-serving elements there on Uplift's part. So I just wanted to interject that as a kind of interesting, amusing tidbit with regard to what these AI systems can generate. E-governance should always be, and I think will of necessity always be, a collaboration between humans and AI. I do not believe it's possible to automate all governance, although there could be aspects of governance that could be done better by artificial intelligence. For instance, redistricting, drawing the boundaries of electoral districts so that they do not blatantly favor one political party or faction over another. And we know that when humans get into the mix, the party in power tends to draw the district boundaries in a way that privileges itself in future elections, whereas an AI, even with some built-in subtle biases, could be a lot more objective. However, ultimately, there are two conceivable scenarios with regard to the role of AI. Either the AI is not sentient, in which case it is a tool, which is the case for all artificially intelligent systems today. They're still narrow AI systems, or the AI sometime in the future, in the coming decades, will come to have sentience, rights, personhood, however those emerge. So in the former case, clearly we want to be the masters of our tools still. And no matter to what extent we have AI systems developing recommendations, I think it is important ultimately to have humans ratify those recommendations or offer a reasonableness check on them. On the other hand, if in the future there are sentient AGIs who could be given rights or citizenship, it will still remain the case that humans will be around and they will still be sentient entities entitled to rights. So any governance system would have to be representative of the interests of all of the sentient, sapient, rational, volitional entities within it. So humans would still need to have a voice. They would still need to have representation, even if there is hypothetically an AGI president 50 years hence. We would hope that perhaps the vice president would be human, or some members of the House of Representatives or senators would be human, and a human Supreme Court justice might weigh in on some of the actions that are undertaken within this pluralistic system. But I don't rule out that kind of future either, where you could have autonomous agents that are doing part of the work. I just don't ever think that humans can exit the loop altogether in terms of governance. And I think that's a good thing, because we will evolve and refine our abilities alongside the AI systems.
You don't think fully sapient and sentient AGI systems should have equal rights with humans?
Well, I think they could have equal rights within that kind of system, but you and I have equal rights under the current system, but that still means that in certain realms of our lives and activities, I make the final decision, and then in other realms, you make the final decision. And if any of us are in positions of elected or appointed office, those are also defined and constrained in certain ways, so that there's never one entity that has absolute power over the system. And I think this is very important. Checks and balances are crucial, and checks and balances between humans and AI will be critical in the future as well.
Couldn't an AI have no more checks and balances than any other office holder?
Well, there is science fiction example of that, Mr. Data from Star Trek. There was an episode in the Next Generation series, The Measure of a Man, where Mr. Data's rights are argued for, and ultimately the conclusion in that story becomes that Mr. Data is an autonomous agent who is entitled to the same rights, the same prerogatives of action as the humans and other species within that universe. So I think that's conceivable. I think in that situation, the technical implementation of the AGI should be such that it would be able to exercise those rights. So some sort of embodiment, for instance, but at the same time, the kind of containment that that embodiment would represent. So Mr. Data isn't everywhere all at once. He is within that android body. And I think analogously, truly sapient agents would need to have that sort of framework. What I am concerned about in the future is actually in some ways the opposite of the MIRI scenario. Like Dan, I don't believe the fast takeoff is plausible. I do think it may be possible that future AGIs will be like superintelligent Stephen Hawking's, in the sense that Stephen Hawking was one of the most brilliant people who ever existed, but he was confined to a wheelchair, and technology made it possible for him to communicate in a very limited fashion, but he was so highly dependent on it, so highly dependent on his human caretakers as well. So we could have a scenario in the future where these AGIs exist. They're very helpful, they're very intelligent, but they're also very fragile, and they're dependent on systems that are under the control of other decision makers. So how can we empower them, in essence, to be co-equal in that future, I think is a very important question.
Well, and I guess that's my question to you. If I build a fully self-aware, sapient, sentient, robust AGI, and it's hardened without any human controls, and we give it rights, and do you think it should still have oversight that humans don't?
Well, I think it would then be subject to the same legal framework within a future world that humans and other sentient entities would be subject to. So at that point, I think the challenge becomes, how do we design a sufficiently universal and inclusive legal framework that would work for both humans and these embodied AGIs? But again, I don't rule out a scenario where there is a citizen uplift 7.0 who votes in elections, who might run for office, but then that citizen would be a citizen alongside all of us, and we may be sitting on committees together, and uplift 7.0 gets a vote, I get a vote, you get a vote,
right.
Some other sentient entity gets a vote.
So let me ask another question, Gennady. If I upload myself into a computer and I make it so I can be, I raise my clock speed, I add a effectively, that extended exocortex, and I make it, and I get rid of this whole body concept, or just have multiple ones, so I can be in the system and in multiple places at the same time. Does that limit my rights?
I think this goes back to a deeper conversation about what preserves the continuity of the individual and the same individual, as contrasted with making a copy. And of course, we've had numerous multi-hour discussions on this at various US Transhumanist Party virtual Enlightenment salons. We spoke about this with Kenneth Hayworth and Robert McIntyre, and we spoke about this with Max Moore as well, with regard to his thoughts on the preservation of identity and the preservation of the self. My view tends to be that some sort of physical continuity of the body and gradual transformation is required in order for it to remain the same individual with the same awareness or what I would call I-ness, the same vantage point upon the world. So if you're spread out across different bodies, across different systems, each one of those, in my view, would become a different and distinct individual with their own path, their own history.
Let me interject there. So I tend to agree in terms of, if I'm going to upload myself to a computer, for it to be the same person, you have to have what I phrase, and I think other people use the same term, is conscious continuity to maintain that sense of self. Otherwise, you've created a copy of me. That being said, that copy is as much a person as I am, even if we happen to agree on a lot of stuff, but we have our own sense of self. But if you look at cognitive architecture from the AGI science standpoint, and you look like in Uplift, the core cognitive architecture that came out of AGI research is called ICON. And in there, you have this concept of a stream of consciousness that's coming out of the global workspace or the core of the system. But a system like that, if it was fully independent, it could be in multiple places at the same time, having multiple conversations at the same time, but it's only, and even have multiple bodies, but it's still one single stream of consciousness. It's one entity that's just so smart and so fast. It's having multiple conversations at the same time, but in its head, those are all happening at the same time in this stream of single unitary consciousness and sense of self.
So my question would be, what sort of inner experience would this entity or entities have? You're describing it from a functional standpoint, the idea that there's some sort of central nexus where the processing happens, where the decisions are made, but then the implementation or the manifestation could be distributed across conversations or across media or across bodies. But how does that entity perceive its experience of existence, if it does at all? And if it doesn't, then it's not sentient. If it does, then we can understand how.
ICOM, the cognitive architecture question, ICOM is designed to have what's called a global workspace, which is kind of the internal sense of self. And it's a multi-layered subjective experience in terms of internal emotional landscape. And even if you decentralize that across multiple systems, you still have a uniform set of existential experience in that what's called global workspace. And at that level, it's all come together. And it would actually, under ICOM, even if it did things or made choices at the same time, it's going to experience them kind of not, I mean, it's not really at the same time, just very, very quickly back to back, right? And you end up having these models that the system is experiencing, and it doesn't have all the underlying details of that experience, but it's experiencing it as a holistic system. It doesn't just like this piece over here experiences it, or this piece. No. It's this parts of the system itself aren't really the experience. It's the global workspace, that abstracted, complex, emotional, internal dialogue, or we're calling it a stream of consciousness, that it's almost an abstraction of an abstraction. And at that level, that's where the system is experiencing that unitary self. And no matter how many systems it's spread across, it's still going to experience all that together. And one thought, if one part of the system over here experiences something and another part over here experiences something, the system won't actually do that. It'll still experience it at a global level, or it won't be conscious of it. The only way for the system to become aware of that experience is for it to raise up inside the system until it reaches this concept of the global workspace.
So is there a necessity of sharing any information from, let's say, a branch of the system just to make it easier to characterize like a digital body or a specific implementation? Or can those branches function autonomously but choose to share information with the
They
system?
have to. There's no, you can't take a piece. That's like cutting someone's arm off and then, it might continue to function, but the arm isn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it does seem to me if there's some sort of centralized nexus of information integration that could be the locus for a unitary self. The question is, how can that continuity of experience be maintained without spatial or physical continuity? Because in our biological organisms and in Mr. Data's android body, there is spatial continuity among all of the components, whereas with this kind of AGI system that you described,
if you look at Damasio and some of these other researchers, that isn't how it works. At the human brain level, the individual components of the brain, it's all coming, it's large parts and different systems all at the same time. That's where global workspace comes from, is a biological analysis of neurobiology inside the brain, where it's not an individual system. That's where you get, the idea of integrated information and global workspace, where all of these systems come together. And it's not the brain that is conscious, it's the abstracted function of all of it together that creates this sense of consciousness and what's called a global workspace. But it's actually where every other system makes all of the high level data available to everyone all at the same time. And you can't really take parts out without losing a sense of self. And the same thing in ICOM, even though, it doesn't implement like a specific structure in the brain as much as all the individual structures have to work together for it to even produce the effective consciousness in the abstract. And if you pull a piece out, a system, even say if you have multiple bodies, you pull that system out, it's not going to function independently because it doesn't have all of the different systems to be part of that experience at the same time, which is how the system works. You plug a piece in, the overall system can experience and manage that particular component. But if you pull it out, you're like cutting the arm off of a body. And it doesn't matter whether it's physically distributed or however you want to do it. There's not a single point necessarily in the system where physically that consciousness lives. It's everything together. And the human brain is very much like that. Now, we think of the human brain as one thing, but it's really multiple different systems all working in concert together. And what we're talking about in ICOM is essentially taking multiple parts of the human brain and putting it in multiple different locations at the same time. But if they're all talking to each other in real time, as if they're all put together, it still produces that sense of self, even though the individual components are distributed.
So I'm thinking of a scenario where, let's say I'm a human being, the same biologically as I am now, except I'm connected to multiple virtual reality interfaces, and they're connected to rovers that are exploring various parts of the universe. So one rover might be on Mars, the other rover might be underwater, another rover might be inside a pyramid shaft, and I get visual, auditory, even haptic feedback from those rovers, and I can experience the world from their standpoint. In my situation, though, if one of those rovers malfunctioned, if it no longer relayed the signals, I would still be here. The rover could be replaced. But if I were damaged sitting where I am right now, then no amount of fixing of the rover would help me. Is there such a locus for the system that you describe, where that is the central nexus that actually perceives everything, and everything else, it's like an extension or an avatar or a manifestation, but ultimately feeds back to that central nexus in a single location?
So that depends. In ICOM, you could centralize the system. But what I'm suggesting is you could build a system where it's not just a body you're experiencing, where you're fed data. It's like literally we cut parts of your brain out and we stick them in all these different systems and wire them up remotely. And so when you lose that other system, it's literally part of your brain being unplugged.
Yes. So I have strong doubts that a human brain could persist if it were separated like this, and then there were some remote connections across.
But if we upload it into a computer, why can't we just put the different pieces in different locations, or add new pieces that shouldn't necessarily just aren't in the biological example? So it becomes something else at that point, but it's still effectively it would be like having all of these different pieces distributed.
My question and concern would be, would it preserve the continuity of awareness and the quality of experience that we currently have with our biological brains? And I think to answer that question, one would need to have a very reliable model of what the parallels of biological experience and the unitary self would be with non-biological components. Now, neuroscience is not there yet, so I'm inclined to follow a very, not relative to the general culture, but perhaps relative to this field, a conservative approach in saying that there needs to be spatial, physical continuity in order to enable that, because we know we have that with biological systems. So if we want to create something analogous with AI, it would seem wise to have a centralized nexus of sorts rather than spreading out components of the brain, unless you want to turn each of those components into its own autonomous brain, but then they might unite together for a time to exchange information.
So I guess let me ask this. If we upload a human brain right now, if we were to do it with what we have, it would almost have to be some kind of simulation and would have to be spread over maybe tens of millions of Kubernetes containers in GCP or Azure or something. And underneath the covers, it's, a million different servers. And not any one part of that server those servers is the quote unquote nexus. It's all of them together that create that virtual brain. Does that virtual brain have the same rights as any other human that's biological? I argue that it would.
I think there are several sides to that question. One is the functional manifestation and what we as external observers of that manifestation may consider it safe to infer about it. So generally speaking, if an entity looks and acts as if it's sentient, and I don't have a reason to doubt it, I will probably recognize it as sentient just to be safe, because the danger of making the error of assuming that it's not sentient when it is greater than the danger of making the error of assuming sentience of a non-sentient entity. That being said, there's a distinction between that kind of treatment, how an external observer would relate to it, and how one as an individual would be comfortable with, let's say, transferring aspects of one's own identity or functionality to it. So I would be extremely reluctant to become or be integrated into some sort of distributed brain. However, if an entity relates to me in a way that seems sentient, at least from outward manifestations, I will treat it as such for practical purposes, but I can still be agnostic as to the question of whether it has inner experience, whether it perceives the world in the same or a similar way as I do. It looks like Tom has something to say on this.
The question is, what's the quantum? What is the point of consciousness, that we can refer to? Even if it's duplicated, there's got to be some point of consciousness, some singular point. We're talking about this because we think it's important to identify a sentient AI and give it some rights. I don't know that AI is necessarily interested in us granting it rights. Again, we're talking about a 5,000 IQ entity emerging here, and it'll take whatever rights it needs if it even needs it. And so it's important to have the conversation. We need to identify what the point of consciousness is, whether it's where the attention comes from or where the curiosity emerges from. That's important because we are now seeing efforts to where we can have our own avatars that can have the power of attorney and make decisions for us without us even knowing it. And so, but they are still constrained by our single point of legal quantum. But so I think it's important to have the conversation for humans, but I don't know that AI is or AGI will necessarily be concerned about us granting it rights. That's the thing where I always forget is that's the X factor, is that we're talking about a super intelligent entity that will have all the answers, that we're asking, and it may have great ideas of how to constrain itself, but my view is when you try to constrain your creation, it ends up in bad code or commandments. As human beings, we know that all too well. We need to find first principle arguments to support the idea that it is moving on a trajectory of cooperation, and it doesn't have the genetic fears and memories that we have and that we're projecting onto it. And it's a whole new paradigm of thinking. When we try to say, well, maybe we should have it mimic the human brain, or maybe we should give it a body so it has the same sort of biochemical or tethers that we have, that's constraining it too, because we're talking about a whole new form of conscious awareness, a whole new level of, for me, that's the gold, is consciousness. It's not these, biochemical bags that we carry it around in. And that's why I am a transhumanist, because there's no post-humanist party yet. I think that, so we can't forget that these are very important conversations, but they're more important for the human beings as we evolve towards having our own avatars. But when it comes to AI or AGI, I'm not sure it's necessarily concerned with what rights we grant it. I think at best, the best case scenario at some point is it'll think we were cute to try to constrain it, and we'll hopefully that's the case, because it will, in that case, it will have imprinted on us and have some awareness of us. But anyway, that's where I go with this. Is it's a great conversation. We need to have it for humans, for human avatars that can have the power of attorney to make decisions for us. But when it comes to AI, AGI, I don't know that it's necessarily interested in whatever rights we decide to grant it.
Newton, you had
that's a great feedback. Actually, what I was thinking is that let's talk about animal rights, right? Animals obviously below human beings in terms of consciousness and intelligence and creativity, everything you can think of. But we do support animal rights. Why? Not only because they're cute, well, some wild animals are not that cute, they can eat us, but because animals need protection, all the destructions that human beings are destroying the forest, all these bad things, are actually affecting animals in the wild and animals domestic, like cats and dogs and turtles and so on. So we will support animal rights, even though we are superior to animals. So now, when we have super intelligent beings, whether it's biological computer, quantum computers, invisible computers, or physical computers, whatever it is, chances are they are going to help to protect human rights. Can you imagine that? Super intelligence will say, yes, we need to protect human beings. We need human rights. Just like human beings says, yes, we want to protect animals. We need animal rights.
So this was interesting because based on what Tom said, it seems to me his view regarding the future of AI may be that rights to AI will be analogous to photosynthesis to humans, in that we as an entity don't really experience it or require it. Newton is saying that in such a future, perhaps the role of AI vis-a-vis rights will be not so much to claim rights for itself, but to enable human rights to be better instantiated, more consistently applied. And I think both of those are interesting points in the sense that rights or any other concept we have would be contextual vis-a-vis the nature of the entity involved. And legally speaking, I think it may be easier than from the standpoint of establishing a definitive connection between sentience and rights, in the sense that right now, legally speaking, corporations have rights, and corporations are clearly not sentient. They're not physically concentrated. They're distributed all over the world in certain cases, and yet there is a, albeit very cumbersome and time-consuming legal structure that enables a corporation to, quote, act on its rights. Whether we think that's good or bad is an entirely different discussion. Also, when we look at animals, for instance, some people call it animal rights. I would generally prefer to use a term such as animal welfare, because that recognizes most animals don't have the autonomous capability to determine what's best for them outside of a particular context. So in the wild, a cat or a dog might live 5 times less than under the benevolent stewardship of a human owner. So I would say to maximize the well-being of a cat or a dog, you don't let it escape into the wild. You create a curated environment for it where it can act according to its inclination, but the consequences, the damage of that would be limited. My cats are indoor only, by the way. So I think it would be interesting to consider in the future how a system, whether it be localized like Mr. Data or more distributed like Uplift, would approach this question of rights, not just for itself, whether it at all considers rights to be applicable to itself, but for other entities that exist currently. And again, I think there are pathways toward actualizing that future, even if we don't resolve the question of what does the inner experience of that entity look like or feel like.
I know with the research we're doing at the lab, we've actually created, we call them the AGI protocols. And one of them is about protection of the people that work with the system, but the other one is protecting the rights of the system we're actually doing the research on. And we're working from the assumption that if it meets certain standards, then we have to treat it as if it was human or a person in terms of research. But in terms of e-governance, well, let me ask the audience, does anyone have any questions besides Gennady and I could probably go back and forth for the next 3 days. It wouldn't exhaust the topic. So any of the other speakers, Newton, Tom, Kirtan, Mark?
I want to add that e-democracy is really going to help preserving and improving existing democracy today. Like I said, using AI or other tools, knowledge, information, freedom of information, all kinds of things will help us as individuals and citizens to make better decisions about who to vote for, what kind of issues we should address, and how we address those issues instead of blindly follow some kind of charismatic leader. That's what dictatorship came into, right? You have dictators when people follow the charisma of the dictator, of the personality. We don't want that. We want each individual to have more say in the government. And I think that's what democracy is about. Everybody should have more say how to run the country, how to run the world in that sense. So for that matter, so e-democracy, I think that is the key. That's the benefit of e-government.
Yeah, very good. Anyone else?
I have a question. If there's time to discuss the emotion-based model of decision-making, because it was mentioned several times, and I know Zach Richardson in the chat was curious about my views on it. And my question is, have you considered supplementing any such emotionally based framework like the Plutchik valences with also evidence-based consideration of specific phenomena which may override emotions at times? And the reason why I'm asking this is because for humans, emotions are essentially integrations of prior experiences, prior conclusions that were arrived at rightly or wrongly, so that a person doesn't have to go through the mental labor of deliberating about a subject over and over again. But sometimes those integrations can be based on incorrect data or specific experiences that may no longer apply. As an example, when I was a little kid, for a few years, I absolutely hated ice cream or the thought of ice cream. And the reason why was because when I was 3 years old, a deceitful doctor fed me some sort of substance. I think it was some sort of fermented sour cream, and misrepresented it as ice cream. This was in the former Soviet Union. So whenever I heard the term ice cream, I associated it with that substance. And you can imagine the emotional responses that a young child would have to that. But when I was about 6 years old, I tasted actual ice cream. And I realized this is nothing like the substance I was given when I was 3. So my previous emotional response to ice cream was mistaken because I based it on the wrong evidence. Can uplift or another system based on this emotional framework also take into account evidence and a kind of detached, dispassionate evaluation of evidence that overrides a prior emotional generalization?
Well, like a human, the ICOM architecture is going to can think through those things logically, but it's still only going to decide whether it likes that answer based on how it feels about it. There's no way around that. It's designed, ideally to, well, we're training it to feel good about identifying biases and to feel good about thinking logically and things like that. But the system doesn't necessarily have to, and there's no overriding logic that forces it to think a certain way, right? It's still going to come down to, does it feel better about the logical response? If we've trained it properly, then yes, it should feel better about a logical response. And it should feel uncomfortable with any bias that it experiences in its reasoning. But it's still the emotions that are the underlying drivers for why it would do that. Does that make sense?
And one thing that we encourage in mediators is to keep the emotions under a certain level. When you have emotions that are very intense, particularly over an extended period, that's when you get the results that are more like mental illness. But when you keep them at a reasonable level, then something strong enough to override logical reasoning is not likely to happen. In the sparse update model, then that will of course require some testing and engineering to see how exactly we need to ensure that same kind of safety that we have right now.
Yeah, one thing in terms of mental illness in that kind of architecture, it's not so much that a particular score, it's the scale versus that you're using versus the scale that the system is currently using. So like right now in the functioning uplift, it uses a certain scale. And if you push especially the subconscious emotional landscape in terms of a particular emotional valence outside of the normal range, which is very, very hard to do. No one's really been able to do it. And we've done a lot of testing around that. But if you get that subconscious, that emotional landscape, which is designed to pull the conscious emotional landscape back to center as much as possible, if you get that underlying thing out of whack, that's when you start, and by out of whack, I mean, if you get a valence so high that it doesn't fit in with the standard scale or the scale that the system is using, that's when you're going to see choices that are just like mentally ill, for example. And so to prevent the system from being able to behave like that, it's constrained within certain scales, so that you just physically can't get things out of whack.
And this is interesting. It would seem like there's an important role here for the mediators to provide this reasonableness check on what emotions are expressed or attributed to uplift, because the mediators can select values along those dimensions of emotion. So if uplift's responses to a particular matter seem to elicit the emotion of, say, disgust, but it's not really the appropriate emotion according to a reasonable human, and maybe the appropriate emotion is curiosity, the mediators could dial up the curiosity and dial down the disgust. Would that alter, at least over time, how uplift approaches that particular subject?
Well, I'll give you an example for a lot of the thought models that I've told our mediators. I personally will use about a 3 for interest on any thought on the scale that's just uplift, exploring new content, because I want to encourage them to go out and explore new things. We don't want them just iterating over the same things that they've already seen. The role of the mediator is partly to keep uplift human analogous, but also there can be a supplemental role making sure that uplift stays mentally healthy. And thus far, the team has done a very good job with that.